Over Billionaires protest this afternoon, where he talked to one of the demonstrators' organizers.
The Indivisible MOV group planned 5 separate Workers Over Billionaires protests at locations across the Mid-Ohio Valley on Labor Day. Dozens with the group gathered in Parkersburg in the afternoon, standing near City Park on the corner of Park Avenue and 23rd Street. Indivisible MOV Action Team co-leader Kim Van Ryn says they're hoping to raise awareness about severe wealth inequality in America.
There are too many people that don't see this as the issue that it is. With the tariffs and inflation, it's going to get harder and harder for working people to be able to afford food, to keep a roof over their head, keep the utilities on. So we want to make sure people understand that this is a problem because the billionaires are getting the tax cuts and not the working people that need it.
Van Ryn emphasizes that this disparity is something that's been growing for decades.
Back in the 50s and 60s, the unions were stronger, people got better pay, they could afford the basics of life better. Now the middle class is being totally hollowed out because pay is not keeping up with inflation. Housing prices have gone through the roof. It's so much less affordable to buy a home these days than it used to be. People are having trouble just buying food and keeping the power on.
Many at the protest wore red bandanas around their necks, a symbol that has its origins in Appalachian labor history.
The red bandana goes back to the days when the miners were trying to unionize, and that was how they signified that they were on the union side, was they wore a red bandana around their neck. The miners back then, a lot of them were immigrants. They didn't have a common language. They certainly didn't have a uniform. So the red bandana was one way that they could tell which side people were on when they went up against the anti-union forces.
Other protests took place in Marietta, Williamstown, and in South Parkersburg. The protests in the Mid-Ohio Valley are part of a nationwide effort led by the organization May Day Strong, with similar protests being held across the country. In Parkersburg, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.
Turning to the weather.